Biofuel video project on cellulosic ethanol. So, cellulosic ethanol is a secondhand renewable fuel source that's produced from plants high in cellulose that aren't suitable for human consumption, so like wood and grass. The process of breaking down the cellulose into fermentable sugars found in these non-food crops is quite expensive. Production of cellulosic ethanol allows us to put the wood and other plant material that we would have otherwise considered waste to good use without contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there are some controversies. It's really expensive because the fungus that must be cultured and fed to make the enzyme responsible for breaking down the cellulose, which is cellulase, requires a lot of energy. Um, the source for cellulosic ethanol, for how it's cultivated, is mainly plant waste, specifically sugarcane bagasse and energy crops like switchgrass. Now, there's two ways to make cellulosic ethanol. One is photosynthesis, so it includes pre-treatment, where fungi like Penicillium funiculosum must be cultured under optimal conditions and extensive energy requirements to produce the enzyme cellulase. Then there's hydrolysis of the biomass, the dead plant waste, by cellulase to break down cellulose into simple sugars like glucose with glycolysis. And then fermentation, where the simple sugars that were converted into pyruvate undergo alcoholic fermentation to produce ethanol. And that's later distilled to isolate the ethanol for actual fuel use. Now, the other way is gasification, in which the biomass is heated under pressure to produce a gas made up of hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. That's then purified for fermentation, and then microorganisms like yeast are used to convert the gas into ethanol. That's also later purified. Now, the development of the status of cellulosic ethanol started really in 1974 with this first act here, which was the first federal declaration of creating renewable fuel, including cellulosic ethanol. And then in 2007, there was a mandate for cellulosic biofuel. The Department of Energy began providing significant funding for cellulosic plants. 2018, we actually saw a decrease in that production and that backing. Nowadays, the government backing for cellulosic ethanol development has dwindled, though there's some hope with new research initiatives like the New Energy Blue cellulosic ethanol plant in Iowa. The carbon footprint of cellulosic ethanol is, there's been hints that the commercialization of it would possibly lead to a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to today's standard gasoline. When it's burnt, it will likely offset the number of crops needed to be grown. It will likely offset the CO2, but the number of crops needed to be grown in order to produce the ethanol will reduce the CO2 that the ethanol emits when it's burnt. Sorry. Though that would mean we would probably actually have to use the edible crops in doing so because it would require so much input. There are some economic impacts of cellulosic ethanol. The biggest one is that there's an inconsistency with the innovation in large-scale production. It's also economically unstable because it depends on the availability of plant waste and feedstock, which cannot be counted on, especially with climate change ongoing. It has a greater chance of outcompeting corn-based ethanol, or outcompeting gasoline consumption than corn-based ethanol does. For the US, a growing cellulosic ethanol industry can mean less reliance on foreign oil markets, providing more of an economic backbone. Now, public awareness is very little. There's been small efforts in Florida back in 2010, but other than that, it's really sparse. My analysis is that the use of cellulosic ethanol as fuel has great benefits on the environment in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but commercialization of it may not be the best foot forward. Since the use of the fuel is in such high demand, I could see greedy companies pushing to use perfectly viable and edible plants instead of just inedible plants. This could backfire and actually cause a famine. So I would implement a strict definition of food stocks so that we would prevent that. And then plan of action, I have some rules, is I would only allow inedible plant waste to be used for cellulosic ethanol production, and I would include a clear definition of food stocks. I would increase research and technological innovation because we need to improve the efficiency of this process. I would educate the public a bit more and encourage them to have more of a green attitude. And I would keep track of greenhouse gas emissions and adjust technologies and implementation based on the actual performance of cellulosic ethanol. So here are my sources, and thank you.